Petrosian gives us a game of pure strategy, not a game bogged down by a lot of side variations, just ideas and concepts, strategic chess at its finest. This game was played in 1959 in the USSR Championship. His opponent is a player called Jacob Yuckman. I actually don't know much about him, but my little bit of research revealed that he was definitely Grandmaster strength, maybe even 2600 level, but he got in trouble with the Soviet authorities, so his career was squashed a little bit. But a very strong opponent. Petrosian has white, Yuckman has black. Let us jump right in. The d4, knight f6, c4, and g6. Knight c3, bishop to g7. A King's Indian against Petrosian. When will they ever learn, e4, d6, bishop e2, castles, knight f3, e5. And of course, the main line here is to castle. And this gives black a number of options, but Petrosian's patented variation, he has played here, d5, immediately gaining space, locking that structure, and not giving black any other options like capturing in the center. The main move here is a5. The idea is so black can play knight a6, c5, and carve out that c5 square where white cannot play b4. But in this case, black plays knight to a6 immediately, going right after the e4 pawn. Petrosian responds with bishop to g5. Again, that's a core move in his variation. Basically, by pinning this knight, he's limiting black's kingside play or slowing it down. Black would like to move that knight and play f7, f5, but that becomes much harder to do with the knight pinned. So black immediately attacks that bishop, tries to get it out of the way so he can move the knight. Bishop to h4, now g5, and white plays bishop to g3. Now, in this game, Yuckman plays knight to h5, but another interesting idea, and actually one I play quite a bit myself, is to just capture on e4. And after knight takes f5, and you have the potential to trap this bishop, the best line for white is to just back up that knight, knight takes, and bishop to f5 with a decent, equal dynamic position. White maybe slightly better. But in this game, black plays knight to h5, clearing the way for the f-pawn to advance, and also that knight can land on the f4 square, or even take the bishop at g3. That's also possible. Petrosian plays knight to d2. So now that knight is under attack. He knows black is going to move the knight, but he has another very key strategic idea behind this knight to d2 maneuver. The knight does go to f4, attacks the g2 pawn, and Petrosian calmly castles and defends that pawn. Knight to c5 is coming, and both of these knights do converge on the d3 square, although what it will do if it lands there is sort of hard to tell. And black does have the potential still to play f7, f5. But Petrosian makes an extremely instructive move. In these structures, these locked King's Indian structures, black's best minor piece by far is the c8 bishop. Often this bishop will sacrifice itself on h3. It creates a lot of pressure. It also backs up this important g4 pawn break. So it's a strategic goal of white to get this bishop off of the board. He'd like to take it with a knight, but if he can't do that, trading it for his own light-squared bishop is always a good move. And Petrosian plays bishop to b4 immediately. It does leave this d3 square a little vulnerable, but he is challenging this c8 bishop and sort of deepening the weakness of this f5 square. a5 is played, so white can't play b4 and kick that knight at c5 away. f3 just further solidify. He knows that at some point these bishops are coming off, and black can't really prevent that, so he just solidifies those light squares. Knight c to d3. The knight does attack b2, which is easily defended. Petrosian just plays queen to c2. Now c6. Black is threatening queen to b6 check, and then taking on b2 is a possibility. So he just steps his king aside. No check, no problem. Now h5, black decides to force a decision of this light squared bishop. He knows if he were to take on g4 and white were to take, then f5 would be it would be impossible for black to play f5 at that point with a pawn on e4 and g4. So he wants Petrosian to be the one to exchange bishops, which he does. Rook takes c8, and now black will try to generate pressure down the c file, maybe take on d5 and do something in that vein. it's a little hard to generate that play, but that really is the source of black's play. Uh, but there's still some kingside potential over here. Petrosian plays a3. Now, this does a couple of things. One, it makes it so that this knight at d3 can't go to b4 to irritate the queen. But more importantly, he knows this knight is going to have to resettle back on c5, and then he might be able to kick it with b4 later. So a3 sets that up as well. Black takes on d5. White could take with the knight. That would be okay too. And after knight d5, queen d3. But instead, he takes with the c-pawn. And now there is this open file, but these knights are rather vulnerable. Black goes ahead and plays the knight to c5. And now Petrosian plays bishop to f2, controlling this key diagonal. We can see how sensitive this a7 g1 diagonal is. So he establishes his own dark squared bishop on the diagonal. And compare the dark squared bishops. F2 is on a nice the bishop at f2 is on a nice diagonal. The bishop at h6 is being blocked by its own e5 pawn. If it wants activity, it would have to go to h6, and g4 would have to be played. G4 is played immediately, and g3 from Petrosian. If black jumps into d3, then you take on g4, knight f2, rook takes, and in this position, white has too much pressure on the king side with a complete clamp on the f5 square, and white has very nice play. So instead, black retreats the knight to g6. Petrosian goes ahead and takes on g4 anyway. And now bishop to e3. What he's doing is unblocking the f-file because he knows black's main source of counterplay is f7, f5. So by moving the bishop out of the way, this rook controls the f5 square. So now it's still very hard for him to play the f5 move. If black tries to force it through with knight to e7, that's a reasonable idea. The only problem is, after f7, f5, if the pawn is taken, his own king could become a little vulnerable. Also, white would be able to get this e4 square, maybe plant a knight on that square. So because of that, black plays b5. Now, this is giving up a pawn, but he's threatening b4 and opening up the c-file. So white has to do something about it, and Petrosian calculates and decides that he can take the material, which he does. Knight takes b5. He is not afraid of a discovery on the c-file, and at the moment, black really doesn't have a discovery of any real value on that c-file, so he plays queen to b6, attacking that knight, putting the queen on a nice diagonal, and Petrosian just plays a4, locks that knight right in place. Queen to a6 is played to get out of this pin so the knight at c5 can move. Now knight to c4. See the target, attack the target, and the target is d6. And both of these knights are threatening that pawn, which at the moment is only defended by the queen at a6. So black plays really something of a desperate move. He plays f5. And the idea behind this move, the reason it's desperate is because white has control over the square, f5, with the queen, rook, and pawn. But the basic idea is to undermine d5 so that that pawn is undefended and maybe gain some pressure, because we can see these light squares around white's king are weak. So he wants to take away the defense of d5 and then attack the d5 pawn. That's black's idea here. Rook takes f5, rook takes f5, ef5, attacking the knight, and black just ignores the threat to the knight and plays queen to b7, threatening to take on d5. We can see that would also be with check. Now, as it turns out, Petrosian could have taken the knight. It actually is still okay here after queen d5 check, king to g1. White is still fine. So, but Petrosian's style, as we know, was to limit his opponent's counterplay to the maximum degree. So instead of doing that, he just plays queen to g2. He just defends the d5 pawn, and he still has serious threats. He's still attacking the knight on g6, and don't forget, he's still attacking this d6 pawn twice. So he just says, don't get into the complications, just defend the weaknesses, and you'll be fine. Knight to b3 is played by black. This looks like a strong idea, attacking the rook at a1, as well as the knight at c4, but now knight c to d6. He does not have time to take white's rook on a1 because his own queen is under attack, as well as his rook. Queen to d7 is played to avoid that threat, and now the attacked rook on a1 goes to f1, and in this position, with very few tactics having been played at all, black resigns because right here, Petrosian has a decisive double attack. The pawn at f5 is attacking the knight, and the knight at d6 is attacking the rook. He cannot defend both, and that would be a decisive material advantage. Another brilliant, pure, strategic game from Tigran Petrosian. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.